So today we're going to be walking through rule number 6 for Ignatius of Loyola's rules for discernment. And rule 6 essentially tells us what we are to do when we find ourselves in desolation. And as rule number 5 exhorted us to, is to not make a change. However, Ignatius does exhort the soul to, when desolation is occurring, that we actually add more fervor to our spiritual lives. And so here is the actual rule 6 in its fullness. The sixth, although in desolation we should not change our first proposals, it is very advantageous to change ourselves intensely against the desolation itself, as by insisting more upon prayer, meditation, much examination, and upon extending ourselves in some suitable way of doing penance. So essentially Ignatius lays out for us kind of the groundwork on how to actually engage the desolations when we find ourselves in them. Just as the former rule told us that we should not make a change in desolation, the sixth rule tells us what we should change. What we can gather from this rule is how we are to combat the desolation. We are not just idle sitting ducks supposed to roll over and die. We are Christians, and because of it, we fight. Which means that we are to use the spiritual tools that we are given. St. Paul beautifully lays these out in an incredible passage in Ephesians. It's Ephesians 6:10 to 18. And it is a little bit of a longer passage, but I want to read it to you in its entirety as it is quite profound. Here's what it says. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rules, against the authorities, against the powers of this world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realm. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your guard. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness, and with your feet fitted with readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayer and requests. Now, as you can see from St. Paul's letter, he is exhorting the early Christians to actually engage in some sort of spiritual battle, to fight against evil, in particular his attacks and desolation. This sixth rule also shows that we as Christians have power against the evil one, not because of ourselves. The enemy doesn't get a monopoly on the Christian life, nor on our own vocations. In fact, he's just one piece, one pawn in the puzzle. God has already defeated the enemy. It's just how are we going to use the weapons that have been entrusted to us? I love how St. Ignatius uses in the rule these words. It's very advantageous to change ourselves intensely. Notice how he's not speaking about changing the situation that we're in, but changing ourselves. To change ourselves in how we're responding to the lot that has been dealt out to us. Just like in Rule 5, where St. Ignatius warns the Christian not to take counsel from the evil one in desolation, so too in Rule 6, he does not talk about rolling over, but reminds us that the enemy is not who we serve. We serve the Lord our God, and therefore we fight in his army. We are not simply mowed over by the enemy's advances, but we are victorious when we engage Christ in the battle. Now, this is a much harder reality than may initially sound. As when we are feeling spiritual desolate, like God is far away and we are not in his favor, the last thing that we want to do is to do more spiritual stuff. However, this is actually what we are called to do. If we want to overcome desolation, we have to also avoid the temptations of not praying as we should. Now, personally, I have experienced this many times over. And I've actually heard a theologian, it was Sertiligens. He wrote this marvelous book called The Intellectual Life. And in it, he actually breaks labor into three categories. He says there is physical labor, intellectual labor, and spiritual labor. He says that physical labor is, yes, it's taxing to the body, but your mind and soul can be completely checked out. It's really only engaging one faculty of the human person. So it's not the hardest type of work. He says then the next hardest is actually intellectual labor, because we have to subdue our body to rest and actually begin to engage our mind to learn. But he says the third is actually the hardest. Spiritual labor is the hardest because it requires us to subdue the body, to subdue the mind, and then to engage the spirit. And so it's using all faculties of the person. So now you can see, right, if we're experiencing desolation and we're really exhausted and we just want to give up, spiritual labor really is the hardest type. And this is why we oftentimes will push it off and actually allow for desolation to prolong longer than it maybe should. Thus, if we're not feeling on our A game, the odds of us adding spiritual things to our repertoire is probably not usually the first thing that comes to mind. And this is why Ignatius exhorts his disciples to use this as a rule to say, hey, when you are feeling at the bottom of the well, it's just at that point that you actually have to add some more food for fodder. Therefore, to actually implore Rule 6 is actually a very hard rule because you feel like God is withdrawn, so why would he help you? But actually, it's an act of faith, which again, the enemy attacks faith, hope, love. So an act of faith is saying, okay, I feel distant from God, but I'm still going to drive hard in the prayer life. This also begs a very important question for our spiritual life. What is the role that suffering actually plays within the Christian vocation? It can oftentimes be the case that when a soul is indeed desiring union with God, they will come to periods of desolation. And it's easy for the soul to simply say this, and it's actually part of the giving up or rolling over. You just say, well, this is my lot. I'm just supposed to suffer like this for God. I just have to endure this and carry my cross. I'm just supposed to be desolate. See, these thoughts may sound holy, but they're not. It's a false piety. The devout person is being duped by the evil one to remain in their desolation. This is not an authentic type of suffering. In fact, desolations are allowed to the soul so that they would overcome them, not live in the midst of them. Now, God gives us consolation so that we can see, this is what it's supposed to be like. And when periods of desolation come, they're literally just trying grounds, or, for example, kind of like a boot camp of sorts to grow in a particular virtue or spiritual gift. God does not desire us to be overwhelmed and burdened. In fact, when his son Jesus says to his disciples, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, it's not a lie. It's actually truth. Thus, if we're experiencing something contrary to this gospel passage, we actually have to step back and examine what is so burdensome about my Christian journey right now. Because if Christ says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, have I taken on things that I'm not meant to carry? Suffering that we are asked to endure, however, is actually a beautiful thing. And it's something that the gospel says on many places, you have to take up your cross and follow after the Lord. Those who have been asked by God to bear a particular burden or cross are actually some of the most joyful people you'll ever meet. I remember encountering this reality early on in my seminary career. I was a freshman in college, first year in seminary. And I remember I was talking to one of the upperclassmen. I'm like, man, so-and-so is just so joyful. Like every day, no matter what's going on, they're just always positive. They're checking in on how you're doing. They're always there on prayer. And I'm like, gosh, he must come from like the perfect family. And my buddy, he laughed. He was his classmate and he knew. He goes, no, man. This guy's got heavy crosses. He says his sister, all right, got pregnant out of wedlock, is in a very trying pregnancy and a very, very abusive relationship. That the family has experienced incredible dynamics surrounding their relationship because the mother passed away from an unexpected illness. And the father actually was undergoing procedures for cancer. And yet here was this man, day in and day out, the essence of joy in the seminary. And it was at that moment that I realized, okay, what makes for a joyful disciple is not that you have all of the best situations. It actually means that you're engaging this interior battle to say, yes, the present burdens are difficult and trying, but I'm going to live with hope. And so this was a lesson that actually substantially marked my own discipleship. And I've kind of had this lens now when interacting with people and it's been tried and true. Some of the most joyful people that I have ever met in my life are also some of the people who have suffered the most, because they have had to choose joy, not as an emotion, but actually as a choice and state of life, a movement of the will. This is an important thing to test if we find ourselves in the midst of great trials and hardships, to make sure that we are not entering into a false piety and carrying something that the Lord doesn't want us to carry. Is actually to ask myself, yes, this is hard. I would totally trade this suffering and pain for anything. But am I joyful or not in the midst of it? Can I still engage faith, hope, and love, even if it is hard during this present lot? Now, remember, St. Ignatius of Loyola, he began his life as a soldier. And so a lot of these rules actually have kind of that soldier mentality of you see an enemy and how do you combat him? Ignatius gives to us 4 weapons or 4 means of attack in this rule. He tells us if we find ourselves in desolation, this is again rule 6, increase our prayer, engage meditation, do much examination, and find a suitable way of doing penance. Now, I think it's important actually, if these are weapons that the church has given us, and Ignatius of Loyola actually exhorts us to use, we should go through each one and to say, okay, what is the weapon that's been entrusted, just like St. Paul was going through all the weapons of the Spirit, so that we know when the day of battle comes how we are going to fight. So the first one, and it's not accidental that it's first, Ignatius says, prayer, increase your prayer. This is prayer in the sense of petitioning God to remove from us obstacles and desolation. It's not like, deep contemplative prayer. In fact, that might be very hard to do in desolation. But prayer that Ignatius is exhorting us to would be something that would allow us to strengthen our belief that God can do all things, even in difficult chances and situations. Keep in mind, in desolation, the enemy will frequently try to subvert this, right? He will say things like, well, this will never end, speaking in absolutes. He'll say, oh, it's always been like this. You can't remember when God was good to you, can you? And he'll say things like, oh, it's just what is. I'm sorry, there's nothing around it. Making us slothful, tepid, and sad. Not wanting to fight, but to actually play like the possum game and just pretend like we're dead. Thus, prayer actually enkindles within us the knowledge of Matthew 7:7. Ask and you will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Just as a really cool acronym in this, if you actually do ask, seek, knock, it's A-S-K. Ask. It's an acronym. So it's really, really an easy way to remember ask, seek, and knock. If we're turning our feelings into the discerning factor of what moves us, we're totally playing in the enemy's field. Because again, the enemy is not engaging our minds and our right reason. He's engaging our passions. So he wants us to feel despondent and discouraged. And he wants us to reaffirm the reality. He wants us to reaffirm the thought process that God cannot do all things. But what Christ exhorts us to do is, even in desolation, to make prayers a petition. This is in fact actually what Christ did on the cross during his crucifixion. There's the line, right? He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, it may sound actually like a very despairing thing to say, but in the Jewish custom, they didn't actually number the psalms like we do. They would just say, like, the first line of the psalm would actually be what psalm they were referring to. So Christ on the cross was doing that. He was quoting Psalm 22. Now, if you get time, actually look up Psalm 22 and read it in its entirety. It is not a psalm of despair. It is a psalm of a soul that is suffering, but trusts that God will use that suffering for something great. And so even Christ, in his own desolation on the cross, was engaging this principle of Ignatius. So, guess who taught Ignatius the principle? Christ, who first expressed this on the cross. The petition to God actually puts a name to the desolation. This is what some of the prayers could sound like. God, please remove the pain of feeling so far from you. Or, God, grant me light in the midst of our darkness. Or the words of St. Augustine in his own Desolation, call and break through my darkness. Shatter my deafness, O Lord. These petitions reveal a direct correlation between the sickness of desolation and the petitioned remedy. Now, that's the first thing, prayer, right? Pretty simple. All of us can engage it. The second one is a little bit harder, and it comes after prayer because it is harder. So if the desolation is not removing itself after prayer, boom, we engage the second one, which is meditation. Now, meditation is not just like prayer. I know those words are often used as synonyms. Meditation for Ignatius was actually engaging the intellect and taking some sort of a scripture passage and actually entering into it. It would be like, for example, being at the anointing in Bethany where Mary pours the oil on Christ's feet. It would be imagining ourselves there and to see how is Christ acting and interacting with the people in that scene. It can actually be really helpful to do these meditations in times of desolation as it begins to get us off of ourselves and back into the reality of Christ. Because what desolation does so often is it just makes our world shrink and think that I'm the only one suffering. If we enter into the Gospels or even into the Old Testament stories, we're able to enter into someone else's life who is actively experiencing God in their life, and sometimes it's like that aha that breaks the desolation. I know personally when I have been in desolation, I've actually engaged some of these things and it's like, wow, this stuff is real. Like, I don't know why I felt so far from God. But again, it required me to move out of the passions of self-pity and into engaging the intellect and the mind. Believing and knowing that God knew this day of desolation would come and that it would perfectly line up with the meditation for the day that we are doing is actually the very definition of providence. So this is where I've actually found the daily readings for Masses to be really consoling. Or I know some people do like the, is it Jesus prayer? Or it's like a book that has meditations every single day. It's from the Protestant tradition. But I've heard a lot of people, right? They've committed to reading that every single day, right? That's their spiritual proposal. And even in desolation, they're not stopping it. Sure enough, this heavy day of desolation comes. They'll read the devotion or they'll read the readings for the day. And it's just like, this is exactly what I needed. Well, this is God's providence, right? He knew you'd receive desolation on the same day that this meditation would come up or this scripture reading. Monsignor Aloysius Callahan, who was the rector in the seminary when I was there, would always tell us, men, if you keep the rule will keep you. And this is exactly Ignatius's wisdom, right? Is if in times of desolation we just keep the spiritual principles that we've engaged in, doing meditation on a daily basis, then the rule will actually keep us safe from breaking down. I cannot tell you how many times I've experienced desolation and I've actually just said, okay, I'm not feeling good, I don't want to pray, but I already committed, I've got to say my rosary, or I've got to go to the chapel and do my holy hour. And I go there, I do my rosary, I go to the chapel, and I'm just like, oh, this is just terrible, grumbling, complaining, and then right at the end of it, the desolation breaks. And what ends up happening is it's a strength of resolve to see, okay, I'm not doing these things because I feel good. I'm doing them because they're right. And God blesses those who do things not just for the reward they get, but actually he blesses those who are persevering even in the midst of trial. Once again, using priorly established routines before the emotions of desolation stir things up is a huge lifesaver for the life of holiness. Ignatius's third weapon that he extends to us, it sounds really weird. He says, do much examination. Much examination. Now, desolation creeps in kind of like a fog, and it's like, okay, I don't know why or when this started. I just feel very far from God, or like prayer isn't happening, or it's just kind of this lethargia that's come over the soul. If we just aimlessly go through our life without actually examining what's happening, we oftentimes will be caught off guard and be baffled. Like, why did this desolation happen? I didn't do anything wrong. This is part of the enemy's tactics. He loves to confuse us. And again, on just this passionate level, right? He's raging all these things, and like that fog, we just don't know where we're at. We get lost and disoriented. Thus, when Ignatius says take much examination, he's telling us to take time to stop, to see when the desolation started. And then it gives us important clues. Because if we're able to reflect to say, okay, am I just acknowledging the desolation, or did it happen a while back? And what was the cause, right? Is it natural desolation where I had bad news at work, or I had bad news from a friend, or I got slighted, or I misplaced something, or someone said something cruel to me? All these natural desolations, and then boom, 4 days later, I'm in spiritual desolation, right? So basically, just by examining where it started, kind of gives us the aha moment. Okay, now I know how to battle it. It's not the origins were not spiritual desolation. They're actually, I don't feel like I'm a good mother or father. I don't feel like my employer respects me, right? And these are the sorts of things that gets our mind moving to the point where then we just kind of say, hey, if they don't respect me, I bet God doesn't either. The other thing that's interesting about Ignatius, and this will come up later in the rules for discernment, is sometimes desolation comes to the soul because we've actually fallen into some sort of sin, right? And so God removes his graces to get us to open up our eyes. It's like he takes away the carrot or the candy so that we say like, oh, I've got to change my behavior. Like I've got to repent of that. Again, much examination will lead to that discovery. Finally, if we have fallen into the false piety, like a false type of suffering, this is oftentimes also where the Lord will allow desolation to come in because it causes us to say, okay, is this a cross I have to bear, or is this just something that I feel comfortable with? And you will find this from time to time, right? Is sometimes desolation and pity, they're actually like that blanket that we just cozy up with. But if we do much examination, we'll be able to see that clearly and go right against it. All these questions can only be asked if we are doing examination. This is why he also says do much examination. This isn't just like a brief thing. This is like we're sitting down, and because we don't want to be in desolation, we're actually seriously examining our conscience. Like, for example, right? If you've been sick, right? It's not uncommon for the first thing to do after you find out you're sick is to say, okay, where did I catch it? Okay, I was with this person who was with this person, and then I think I got there, and then, okay, yep, and that's when I got sick. That's where I caught it from. Or to say, I started with this symptom as, I just had a little bit of a sore throat, and then it kind of went into chills, and then it went into a high fever, and then it went into a cough, and it's like, oh my gosh, I got COVID, right? So these are the sorts of things that as we do that examination, we can trace the projection. The enemy doesn't like to be seen. And in one of Ignatius's later rules, we'll talk about how much the enemy loves to work in the secret silence and in the shadows. The enemy is a coward, and he knows that if he is discovered, he will be kicked out. And this is where, when we do much examination, we can see where the enemy is prowling, and we can begin to apply the antidote right to what is ailing us. There is an adage that goes, to look for a cause is to look for a cure. And if we do this examination, we're able to find the cause so that we can directly apply the cure. Ignatius's final weapon that he extends to us is a very interesting one. It says, extending ourselves in some suitable way of doing penance. This is interesting because I think penance in our modern day has kind of gotten a bad rap, right? Like, we'll read about like the uncultured people who would flagellate themselves and do long vigils and do these extreme penances of walking pilgrimages until their feet were bleeding. But actually, penances are not that abnormal. Just think about the last time, right, you went to a doctor's appointment, or just even you just kind of felt blah, and you're like, okay, I got to start eating better, or I got to start working out. And the first couple days are just torture. I remember I was starting this new kind of thing. It's like intermediate fasting. And it means like you stop eating at a certain time in the night, and then you don't start eating again until 16 hours have passed. And the first time that I did it, like I had this throbbing headache. I was irritable and angry. And I was just like, oh, this is terrible. I don't know if I can do this anymore. But then after the first day, I pushed through it, did it a couple more times. And then boom, like I can do it without any sort of issue. And it's actually been an incredibly energizing thing for me. in my own diet plan, but it required those first initial difficulties, those times of penance. Now, the spiritual penances, they also help us regain health of soul and get us back onto a normal equilibrium when we're afflicted with the ailment of desolation. So here are just a couple of examples of penances that we can do if we find ourselves in desolation. These are things that I have seen work both in my own life and also work in the lives of others who I've done direction for. So adding just a little bit of extra time for prayer. Now here's what this would look like, right? It's not like, you're adding, substantial vigils or anything like this. But it would basically mean like, for example, if you're working, you cut your meal short and you go and do a walking rosary, right? Or you, at the end of the day, right, you just say, okay, maybe if you're in the married state, right, okay, I just got to take a little bit of time before I come to bed. I can't watch the show that we're normally going to watch. I just got to take a little extra time for prayer. Again, these are not permanent life penances. These are just temporary to get things to kind of overturn the desolation. Another one that I've seen work well, to give up soda, beer, or coffee for a day. By denying these little pleasures that oftentimes will rekindle that zeal and that love, is we're actually doing things for the Lord rather than just, again, rolling over and playing dead. Pick up a spiritual book or an audio MP3 file or a CD. Just listening to something religious can sometimes be like break the mold or dust out the cobwebs so that we can once again feel the zeal and closeness of God. Or, this is one that I really like, but it sounds kind of crazy, is to sleep on the floor. Just for a night, sleep on the floor. Or sleep with no pillow. Just something to kind of make it a little bit more austere. Or, again, this might sound really dumb, but it works. Put a pebble in your shoe. Just something that as you're irritated just a little bit, it kind of keeps you thinking about God, and then you can engage the first weapon, which is prayer. Or visit someone that you don't like. Obviously, in this time of shelter in place, you can't do that. But you can call or text or email someone that you may not be too fond of, and you're like, that's the last person I want to talk with right now. But that act of charity breaks through the desolation. Just one of these is oftentimes enough to totally smash the desolation because it reawakens that initial zeal. Penance is golden in that it gets us away from doing what we feel, again, working on the passions, to actually engaging a right behavior with the mind. When we encounter desolation, these are proposals for how to fight. They are arranged in this order for less extreme to more extreme measures. Sometimes one will do, sometimes all four of them will need to be engaged. But keep in mind, this is always just for a short amount of time until the desolation breaks. By adding something even for a day or two, it can have profound impacts on our spiritual state. Again, these are not supposed to be like Lent 2.0 things. These are just natural things in the spiritual life when as soon as the light comes on, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm in desolation. Then boom, we start to make some spiritual proposals to increase our zeal. Battles never last forever, and neither does desolation. It is just a season. So God bless you, and I hope that this helps combat any of the desolations that you've had or prepares you for the desolations to come in the future.